My husband called me his trophy wife at the annual investors gala, laughing as he told everyone I was just pretty arm candy with no financial sense. 6 months later, his luxury car dealership empire was in shambles when I exposed his systematic embezzlement to the board. He never realized I'd been documenting his financial crimes and building relationships with his partners all along. The shocked expressions on their faces when they unanimously elected me board chair still brings a smile to my face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of the Franklin Automotive Group's annual gala sparkled above the sea of designer suits and cocktail dresses. Another successful evening celebrating record profits, at least that's what everyone would call it in tomorrow's business journals. I smoothed the silk of my crimson dress, carefully chosen to be memorable yet appropriate, while observing the power players who controlled my husband's world. In this room full of automotive executives and investors, being forgettable wasn't an option, but being taken seriously seemed impossible. "Victoria, darling, there you are." Maxwell's voice carried that particular tone he reserved for public appearances, charming on the surface with an undercurrent of control. My husband of 12 years appeared beside me, champagne flute in, hand, his other arm immediately circling my waist in what photographers would capture as affection, but I recognized as possession. "The Hamiltons were asking about you," he said, steering me toward a couple near the bar. "I told them you've been busy planning our anniversary celebration next month." I nodded, maintaining the smile I'd perfected over the years, the one that reached my eyes just enough to seem genuine without revealing anything authentic behind it. A professional smile, though Maxwell would never recognize it as such. James Hamilton, CEO of Platinum Investments, extended his hand as we approached. "Victoria, wonderful to see you again. Your husband's been telling us about Franklin Automotive's expansion plans. Ambitious move into the European market." "James and I were just discussing the financing structure," Maxwell interjected before I could respond. "The kind of conversation that would bore you to tears, wouldn't it, darling?" He squeezed my shoulder affectionately. To the Hamiltons, it would look like consideration. Maxwell protecting his wife from tedious business talk. I felt the subtle pressure of his fingers, the unspoken reminder of the role I was expected to play. "Sarah was just telling me about your background in financial forensics before you got married," Elizabeth Hamilton said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. "Cornell finance program, wasn't it?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Maxwell's face, quickly replaced by indulgent amusement. "Ancient history now. Victoria traded spreadsheets for social calendars, didn't you, love? Much better suited for her talents." I met Elizabeth Hamilton's gaze briefly, noting the slight furrow in her brow. Unlike her husband, she wasn't smiling at Maxwell's dismissal. "I still keep up with industry publications," I offered, my voice modulated to sound casual. "Old habits." Maxwell laughed, the sound just a touch too loud. "My wife thinks reading Automotive Monthly means she understands the business. Adorable, isn't it?" The Hamiltons' smiles tightened, but Maxwell didn't notice. In 12 years of marriage, my husband had developed a remarkable ability to see exactly what he expected, to see and nothing more. And what he expected to see was a decorative wife whose Cornell degree and 7 years in forensic accounting were nothing more than an interesting backstory, long since superseded by her more natural role as Mrs. Maxwell Franklin. "If you'll excuse me," I said, maintaining my careful smile. "I should check on the charity auction items. I helped organize the foundation component tonight." "Always the perfect hostess," Maxwell said proudly, as though my coordination of a fundraiser that would generate over $5 million for automotive education scholarships was equivalent to arranging flowers for a dinner party. As I moved through the crowd, I noted Richard Westfield by the cocktail bar, deep in conversation with Thomas Chen. The two men controlled significant investment portfolios, and I knew from quarterly reports that both had recently increased their positions in Franklin Automotive Group. What I knew, and Maxwell didn't, was that both were also deeply concerned about inconsistencies in the company's financial reporting. I caught Richard's eye, and he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. Tonight wasn't the time. 3 more months of careful documentation, and everything would be ready. In the relative quiet of the auction display area, I checked my second phone, the one Maxwell knew nothing about. 3 messages from Naomi Parker, my former colleague at Hanover Financial Investigations. Offshore account confirmed, $14 million transferred. Last quarter. Singapore records match your theory. Wire transfers coincide perfectly with consulting fees. Call me when you can. Need to discuss timeline for SEC disclosure. I deleted the messages and slipped the phone back into the hidden pocket of my gown. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and not coincidentally, the government agency that would be very interested in learning about the systematic embezzlement scheme Maxwell had been running for the past 5 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What my husband didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 years meticulously documenting every financial discrepancy in Franklin Automotive's books, building relationships with key investors, and preparing a comprehensive case that would expose Maxwell's crimes while protecting the company's overall operations. I'd chosen my approach deliberately. The patient, methodical compilation of evidence rather than a hasty confrontation. It seemed fitting for someone who specialized in forensic accounting before becoming a trophy wife. There you are. I turned to find Olivia Reed, my personal assistant officially, and my research partner unofficially, as far as Maxwell knew. "The Hamiltons are looking for you," she said quietly. Mrs. Hamilton specifically. She asked if you had time for a private word. Interesting. Elizabeth Hamilton rarely sought me out at these events. As the wife of Maxwell's primary investor, she typically followed the same unwritten rules that governed all the automotive executives' wives. Focus on social niceties, avoid serious business discussions, and never, ever outshine your husband. "Tell her I'll meet her in the garden terrace in 5 minutes," I replied. Olivia nodded and disappeared into the crowd with efficient grace that made her invaluable. On paper, she coordinated my social calendar and charity work. In reality, she functioned as my deputy in the investigation, handling everything from document analysis to discreet interviews with former employees. I made my way to the garden terrace, a smaller space off the main ballroom where sculpted greenery and privacy screens created conversation nooks. Elizabeth was already there, 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table before her. "Victoria," she said, rising to greet me. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," I replied, taking the seat opposite her. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth glanced around to ensure we were truly private before leaning forward. "I thought you should." "No, James is concerned about Maxwell's financial reporting. The quarterly numbers don't align with market performance, and the European expansion seems to be running significantly over budget." I kept my expression neutral, despite the confirmation of what my own investigation had already discovered. "I'm sure Maxwell has explanations for any discrepancies," I said carefully. "That's just it," Elizabeth said, her voice lowered further. "James has tried to discuss it directly, but Maxwell becomes defensive, insists everything is being managed properly." She hesitated. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I had my suspicions. Elizabeth held my gaze. "Because unlike my husband, I remember exactly who you were before you became Mrs. Franklin, Cornell's top forensic accounting graduate, the analyst who uncovered the Westbourne securities fraud, the expert witness in 3 major financial crimes cases." I said nothing, waiting, and Elizabeth continued. "Because I've noticed you watching. During board presentations, investor meetings, financial discussions, You observe everything while appearing to focus on nothing of importance, almost as if— She paused, searching for the right words. Almost as if I'm gathering information? I suggested, maintaining a neutral expression. Almost as if you already know something is wrong, she finished, our eyes locked in silent understanding. I'd always known Elizabeth Hamilton was observant, but I hadn't realized she'd been watching me as carefully as I'd been monitoring Maxwell. After a moment, I allowed my professional smile to transform into something more genuine. Hypothetically, I said carefully, if someone were investigating financial irregularities in her husband's company while he remained completely unaware, what would you think of that? Elizabeth's lips curved into a small smile. Hypothetically, I'd think that person must be extraordinarily patient and perhaps married to someone extraordinarily unobservant. Or perhaps, I suggested, married to someone who sees exactly what he expects to see and nothing more. Elizabeth nodded slowly. James mentioned that Platinum is considering an independent audit of Franklin Automotive's books. Translation: Platinum was preparing to investigate potential fraud, which would leave Maxwell's expansion plans, and possibly his entire company, in jeopardy. That would be unfortunate timing with the European dealerships midway through acquisition, I observed. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. Though I understand the SEC might already be taking an interest in certain aspects of Franklin's international transactions. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maxwell himself, slightly flushed from what I guessed was his fourth whiskey of the evening. There you are, Victoria. I've been looking everywhere, he said, barely acknowledging Elizabeth's presence. The Callaways want to discuss hosting their daughter's wedding reception at our estate. I told them you'd handle all the details. He turned to Elizabeth with a broad smile. My Victoria has a real talent for planning these society events. Never met a woman who could coordinate a seating chart and 5-course menu like she can. I rose smoothly, noting the flicker of dismay on Elizabeth's face at Maxwell's dismissive tone. Elizabeth and I were just discussing the charity auction, I said. The scholarship fund should exceed our target this year. Wonderful, wonderful, Maxwell said distractedly. Now, about the Callaways. Actually, Maxwell, Elizabeth interrupted. We were discussing Victoria's insights on automotive market trends. Her analysis of consumer financing patterns is quite compelling. Maxwell laughed, the sound indulgent and condescending. Oh, Elizabeth, that's very kind of you to humor her. Victoria likes to think she keeps up with the industry, but between us, her understanding doesn't extend much beyond color trends and interior styling. He placed his hand on my lower back, the pressure slightly firmer than necessary. Isn't that right, darling? Leave the business to the businessmen. I caught Elizabeth's eye over his shoulder, seeing in her expression the same thing I felt, the perfect mixture of indignation and opportunity. Because every time Maxwell dismissed me, he reinforced his own blindness. And in 3 short months, that blindness would cost him everything he'd built. Of course, dear, I said, my professional smile firmly back in place. Whatever you think, best. The Callaways turned out to be exactly as Maxwell had described them. New money with aspirations to old money credibility. The kind of clients who believed a 6-figure wedding reception at the Franklin estate would somehow erase the fact that their fortune came from discount medical supplies. As I guided them through a discussion of their daughter's vision, I couldn't help but note the irony. Here was Maxwell entrusting me to handle a $200,000 event contract because I was so good with these things, while simultaneously believing I couldn't possibly understand the business implications of the transaction. The West Lawn has the most dramatic sunset views, I explained, showing them photographs on my tablet. If you're planning an August wedding, I'd recommend a ceremony. Timed for golden hour, followed by dinner under a pavilion near the Rose Garden. Mrs. Callaway nodded eagerly. That sounds perfect, doesn't it, Robert? Before Mr. Callaway could respond, Maxwell materialized at our table, placing his hand possessively on my shoulder. "How are we doing here?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated enthusiasm he used with potential clients. "Has my wife convinced you that the Franklin estate is the only choice for Amber's special day?" "We were just discussing the West Lawn," I said smoothly. "The Callaways are considering an August date." "Excellent, excellent," Maxwell said, pulling up a chair. "You know, the estate grounds were my vision entirely. When we purchased the property 5 years ago, everyone said 15 acres was excessive for a private residence. Now it's our most effective client relations tool." He leaned toward Mr. Callaway conspiratorially. "Sometimes you have to ignore the experts and trust your instincts. Isn't that right, darling?" The last part was directed at me, accompanied by a wink meant to be affectionate but landed as condescending. I maintained my professional smile, knowing what was coming next. "You'll have to forgive my wife if she gets too caught up in the details," Maxwell continued. "Victoria has an eye for color schemes and menu planning, but she sometimes misses the bigger picture. That's why we make such a good team. She handles the pretty things. I handle the bottom line." Mrs. Callaway tittered nervously while her husband looked uncomfortable. They weren't alone. I'd noted over the years that Maxwell's dismissive commentary about my capabilities often created awkward moments with clients and colleagues. Not that he ever noticed. What Maxwell also failed to notice was that the estate had been a questionable investment when Franklin Automotive acquired it, available only because the previous owner had faced tax evasion charges. The vision he now claimed credit for had actually been my suggestion, whispered in the ear of a board member who subsequently proposed it as if it were his own idea. Through that indirect route, Maxwell had discovered the opportunity I'd identified. "If you'll excuse me," I said, rising gracefully, "I need to check on the auction results. Maxwell can walk you through the contract details." Maxwell immediately launched into his standard monologue about Franklin's bespoke event experiences, already forgetting my presence before I'd fully left the table. As I made my way through the ballroom, I caught Naomi Parker's eye across the room. My former colleague and current investigative partner nodded subtly toward the exit, indicating she needed to speak privately. I found her in the quiet hallway leading to the hotel's business center, tablet in hand and expression serious. "The Hamilton situation is accelerating," she said without preamble. "Platinum's board has scheduled an emergency meeting for Tuesday. Our sources say they're voting on whether to demand full forensic accounting for all Franklin Automotive holdings, sooner than we expected." "Any idea what triggered this?" I asked. Naomi swiped through several screens on her tablet. "The Milan dealership acquisition is 42% over budget, and the Berlin property has hit legal complications. But the real issue seems to be the Dubai transfers." She showed me the financial report, and I felt a chill, despite having suspected something like this for months. The Dubai operation, Maxwell's crown jewel and the project he'd leveraged heavily to secure financing for his entire European expansion, was reporting sales figures that simply didn't align with actual inventory movement or regional market conditions. "Someone's manipulating the numbers," I said, studying the discrepancies. "It looks like it," Naomi agreed. "Either Maxwell knows and is deliberately misleading investors, or he doesn't know and his finance team is keeping him in the dark. Either way, when Platinum discovers this, they'll pull out completely," I finished. "Which means we need to accelerate our timeline," Naomi said. "The documentation is comprehensive. We can have everything prepared for the SEC within 2 weeks instead of 3 months." I considered the implications. For nearly 3 years, I'd been patiently building a case against Maxwell's financial crimes, originally planning a gradual approach. I'd envisioned a controlled disclosure to the board, perhaps even giving Maxwell an opportunity to cooperate and mitigate the damage. But as the evidence mounted and his dismissive attitude calcified, I'd recognized that no revelation would change how he saw me. Maxwell would always find a way to diminish my involvement, to frame my discovery as somehow less significant than his own transgressions. And so my strategy had evolved from seeking recognition to ensuring justice, the justice that now appeared to be arriving ahead of schedule. "How much exposure do we have to Maxwell's potential arrest?" I asked. "Minimal," Naomi assured me. "The documentation clearly shows you had no involvement in or knowledge of the embezzlement until after you began the investigation. In fact, your cooperation with authorities would be seen positively by prosecutors." I nodded, decision made. "Move forward with the accelerated timeline. And Naomi, make sure our presentation to the board emphasizes the company's viability post-Maxwell. James Hamilton will be looking for a way to extract his investments without destroying Franklin Automotive Group entirely. Already drafted," she confirmed with a slight smile. "Elizabeth Hamilton has been quite helpful in suggesting language that would appeal to her husband's concerns." I raised an eyebrow. "Elizabeth has been more directly involved than I realized. Let's just say she's been quietly supportive of ethical governance for some time," Naomi replied. "Her foundation has backed several corporate transparency initiatives, all through carefully structured vehicles that don't attract attention." The pieces clicked into place. Elizabeth's pointed comments earlier, her awareness of the investigation, her willingness to provide insight into Platinum's thinking. She wasn't just an ally of convenience. She'd been watching and supporting from the shadows all along. "Interesting," I murmured. "Set up a private lunch for the three of us next week. If we're accelerating the timeline, we'll need to coordinate more directly." Before Naomi could respond, the hallway door opened, and Maxwell appeared with Gregory Vance, Franklin Automotive's chief financial officer. "Victoria, there you are," Maxwell said, his tone slightly sharp. "The auction winners are looking for you. They want photos for their social media." He barely glanced at Naomi, dismissing her as unimportant. "And who is this?" "Naomi Parker," I said smoothly. "My event coordinator for the Scholarship Foundation. We were just discussing the final fundraising total." Maxwell nodded absently, already turning his attention to more important matters. "Gregory and I need to use the business center for a moment. Apparently, there's some confusion about the Milan property acquisitions that simply can't wait until Monday." He sighed dramatically. "The trials of international expansion. Never a moment's rest, even during a gala." I noted the tension in Gregory's posture, the slight sheen of sweat at his temples despite the cool temperature of the hallway. The CFO knew something was wrong with the numbers. The question was whether he was the one manipulating them or merely the one who had discovered the manipulation. "Of course," I said. "I'll handle the auction winners. Will you be rejoining the main event after your meeting?" Yes, Maxwell said impatiently. "The Hamiltons want to discuss next steps for the Berlin dealership. James seems concerned about some regulatory nonsense, but I'll set him straight. These European bureaucrats just need to understand how the game is played." I exchanged a glance with Naomi, both of us recognizing the implications of Maxwell's cavalier attitude toward international regulations, another red flag that Platinum would not be pleased to discover. "Don't keep the Hamiltons waiting too long," I suggested. "James mentioned they have an early flight tomorrow." "Yes, fine," Maxwell replied distractedly, already ushering Gregory toward the business center. "Oh, and darling, when you speak with the auction winners, try to steer the conversation away from business matters. You know how you sometimes get confused about the financial details." The business center door closed behind them, leaving Naomi and me alone in the hallway once more. "Does he always speak to you that way?" Naomi asked quietly. "Only when he's worried," I replied, noting the subtle signs of stress in Maxwell's behavior. "And only in public. When we're alone, he doesn't talk about business at all. In his mind, I'm so far removed from that world that it wouldn't even occur to him to discuss it with me." "His blind spot," Naomi observed. "His fatal flaw," I corrected. "Accelerate everything. I want the full presentation ready by Monday. When Platinum demands answers, Maxwell will have exactly 48 hours before the SEC receives our documentation. We'll make our move in that window." Naomi nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. After 3 years in the shadows, the truth is about to step into the light. And Franklin Automotive is about to discover what happens when you dismiss someone as just a trophy wife, I added, allowing myself one moment of anticipation before returning to the perfect professional smile I'd spent years perfecting. It was time to congratulate the auction winners and assure them their generosity would help the next generation of automotive professionals, maybe even some young women who, like me, would learn to use others' underestimation as their greatest competitive advantage. The house was quiet when we returned from the gala. Maxwell had insisted on an additional stop, drinks with the Carson Group at the Metropolitan Club, where he'd consumed 2 more whiskeys while explaining his visionary expansion strategy to increasingly uncomfortable investors. By the time our driver pulled into the circular driveway of our Westlake mansion, Maxwell was halfway to unconscious, his speech slurred and his confident demeanor deteriorating into belligerence. "Need to call Gregory," he mumbled as I helped him from the car. "Dubai numbers don't make sense." "In the morning," I said, guiding him up the marble steps. "It's after midnight." "You don't understand," he insisted, leaning heavily against me. "Business. Complicated. Numbers very important." "I'm sure it is," I replied automatically, the practiced response of years. Agree, soothe, never challenge, especially when he was in this state. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway, concern evident in her expression. She'd been with us since we married, and she'd seen this scenario play out countless times before. "I'll take him upstairs," she said quietly. I nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I need to handle a few things in the study." Maxwell was already being led away, still mumbling about Dubai and projections, when he suddenly turned back, toward me, his expression surprisingly lucid for a moment. "You looked beautiful tonight," he said. "The perfect wife for a man in my position." Then he was gone, guided up the sweeping staircase by Mrs. Chen's practiced hand. I watched until they disappeared, wondering if he'd ever understand the irony of his words, that being the perfect wife in his eyes had provided the perfect cover for building a case that would soon destroy his carefully constructed empire. I waited 15 minutes to ensure Maxwell was settled, then made my way to my private study. Unlike the grand mahogany-paneled office where Maxwell occasionally brought colleagues for drinks and cigars, my study was a smaller room adjacent to the library, ostensibly designed for managing household accounts and correspondence. The space was deliberately understated, feminine without being frilly, elegant without being imposing, the kind of room visitors would glance at and immediately categorize as a ladies' study where no serious business could possibly occur, which made it the perfect command center for my investigation into Maxwell's financial crimes. I unlocked the antique desk's hidden compartment and removed a slim laptop, not the rose gold MacBook Air that Maxwell had given me for keeping track of your charity work, but a high-performance machine with encrypted connections to secure servers. Within moments, I was reviewing the documents Naomi had prepared following our conversation at the gala. The financial analysis of Franklin Automotive's position was even worse than I'd anticipated. The company had leveraged its domestic dealerships to finance the European expansion, using the inflated performance projections from the Dubai operation to secure favorable terms. When those projections were revealed to be fabricated, not only would new financing disappear, but existing loans would likely be called due immediately. My phone vibrated with an incoming call, the secure line, not my regular number. "Elizabeth Hamilton." "I assume you've seen the numbers," she said when I answered, no preamble necessary. "Just reviewing them now," I confirmed. "It's worse than we thought." "James is furious," Elizabeth said, her voice tight. He met with Gregory Vance privately. After you left. The Dubai reports were deliberately altered before being presented to the Platinum Board. When James confronted Maxwell about it, he claimed ignorance, blamed it on overzealous junior analysts trying to impress the executive team. I sighed, unsurprised but still disappointed. Does Maxwell know the extent of the problem? That's the thing, Elizabeth replied, frustration evident in her tone. I'm not sure he does. When James pressed him about the regulatory issues in Berlin and the construction overruns in Milan, Maxwell kept insisting everything was under control. Not like he was lying, but like he genuinely believed it. I considered this as I scrolled through the financial reports. It fit with patterns I'd observed over the years, Maxwell's tendency to dismiss problems, to believe his vision would somehow overcome practical obstacles through sheer force of will. He surrounded himself with people who reinforced this belief, who massaged numbers and hid complications until they became too significant to conceal. The Platinum Board vote is being moved up, Elizabeth continued, tomorrow afternoon instead of Tuesday. James couldn't stall any longer once the Dubai discrepancies came to light. This accelerated our timeline even further. How certain are you of the outcome? 100%, Elizabeth said firmly. Platinum is pulling all financing, effective immediately. They're issuing a press release Monday morning. I checked the calendar. That gives us less than 36 hours before the markets open and the news breaks. James is worried about fallout, Elizabeth added. Not just financial, but reputational. Platinum has backed Franklin Automotive for over a decade. Questions will be asked about why they didn't spot the issues sooner, which makes them the perfect ally when we present our findings to the SEC, I noted. We can position it as Platinum taking immediate action once the full extent of the fraud was discovered. Exactly what James needs to hear, Elizabeth agreed. How quickly can you move? I closed the financial reports and opened a new document. Contingency plans I had developed years ago, updated regularly as circumstances evolved. By the time Platinum issues their press release, we'll have everything ready for both the SEC and Franklin's board. Clean, straightforward, comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud. And Maxwell? What will this mean for him personally? I paused, considering the question. Despite everything, it wasn't vengeance I sought, at least not entirely. The evidence is clear-cut. Securities fraud, wire fraud, multiple counts of embezzlement. He'll face criminal charges without question. But the company itself can survive with proper restructuring and transparent leadership. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. And what about you? Are you prepared for your role in this to become public knowledge? For Maxwell to learn the truth? About your investigation? It was the question I'd asked myself countless times over the past 3 years. In the beginning, I'd kept my suspicions and subsequent investigation secret out of practical necessity. Maxwell would have seen any questioning of his business practices as disloyalty, an unwelcome challenge to his authority as both CEO and husband. Over time, as the evidence mounted and I recognized the strategic advantage of anonymity, the secret had evolved into something more complicated. Yes, I said finally. It's time. After ending the call with Elizabeth, I spent another hour reviewing documents and sending encrypted instructions to Naomi and our small team of trusted investigators. By the time I finally closed the laptop and returned it to its hiding place, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the window. I made my way upstairs to the master suite, where Maxwell lay sprawled across our king-sized bed, still in his tuxedo trousers and undershirt. In sleep, his face relaxed from its usual expression of confident certainty. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, remembering why I'd fallen in love with him 15 years earlier. His ambition, his charisma, his absolute conviction that he could achieve whatever he set his mind to. Those same qualities had eventually created the gulf between us. Ambition became arrogance, charisma turned to condescension, conviction hardened into inflexibility. The man who had once found my intelligence and drive appealing had gradually reshaped me in his mind, casting me as a supporting character in his success story, rather than a partner in our shared journey. And I had allowed it, encouraged it even, creating the perfect camouflage for building a case he couldn't dismiss or control. I changed quietly into silk pajamas and slipped into bed beside him, careful not to disturb his whiskey-induced slumber. In less than 48 hours, everything would change. The Franklin Automotive empire would begin to crumble. Maxwell would face the consequences of his actions, and the truth about my role would emerge from the shadows. As I drifted toward sleep, I wondered if that revelation would bring satisfaction, or simply sadness for what might have been if he'd been able to view me as a partner, rather than a possession. Perhaps both. My last conscious thought before sleep claimed me was not of triumph or revenge, but of a simple truth I'd learned during my years of invisible investigation. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. Sometimes being dismissed as just a trophy wife provides the perfect cover for becoming an instrument of justice. Morning arrived with the oppressive weight of Maxwell's hangover and the relentless ping of his phone receiving message after message. I was already showered and dressed when he finally stirred, groaning as consciousness brought the full impact of the previous night's excesses. "What time is it?" he mumbled, shielding his eyes from the sunlight filtering through the automated blinds. "Just after 9, I replied, setting a glass of water and 2 aspirin on his nightstand. "You have 17 missed calls, mostly from Gregory." Maxwell grabbed his phone, squinting at the screen. "Damn it," he muttered, immediately, hitting the callback button. I moved toward the door, giving him privacy for what was clearly an urgent business matter, but his next words froze me in place. "Gregory, slow down," he said, voice still rough with sleep. "What do you mean discrepancies? Those projections were vetted by the entire finance team." I paused, watching as Maxwell's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's impossible," he insisted. "The Dubai operation is performing exactly as forecasted. I saw the reports myself last quarter." Another pause as he listened, his face draining of color. "Emergency board meeting today?" No. You're overreacting. Call Hamilton. Tell him it's a simple misunderstanding. We'll clarify the numbers tomorrow." As Maxwell continued his increasingly desperate conversation, I slipped quietly from the room, my mind already shifting to the cascade of events now set in motion. By this time tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade of Franklin Automotive's expansion would begin to crack. By the end of the week, the company Maxwell had spent 20 years building would be on the verge of collapse, and he would be facing criminal charges. Maxwell moved through the house like a man possessed, barking orders into his phone while frantically gathering documents. His typical Sunday routine, leisurely brunch, perhaps a round of golf at the country club, had been abandoned in favor of crisis management. "I need everyone at the office in 1 hour," he snapped to someone on the other end of the call. "Everyone, Gregory. I don't care if it's Sunday. Cancel whatever brunches or tennis matches or whatever the hell else. This is an emergency." I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a light breakfast he wouldn't eat and coffee he would gulp down without tasting. The routine was familiar from previous crises, though none had carried the weight of this one. "Victoria!" he called, appearing in the doorway with his tie askew and hair still damp from his rushed shower. "I need to go into the office. Emergency situation." "Of course," I replied, sliding a travel mug of coffee across the counter. "Anything I can help with?" He laughed, a short, distracted sound with an edge of hysteria. "Unless you've suddenly become an expert in international automotive financing, probably not." He grabbed the coffee, barely glancing at me. "There's some confusion with our European expansion numbers. Nothing serious, just bureaucratic nonsense that needs sorting." The lie came easily to him. Whether to protect me or himself I couldn't be sure. Perhaps both. Should I cancel our dinner with the Richardsons tonight? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, yes, he said distractedly, checking his watch. Make my apologies. Say I've come down with something. Nothing serious. Just indisposed. Of course, I repeated, the dutiful wife managing social obligations while her husband handled important matters. He paused at the door, seeming to remember something. Oh, and I might be late tonight. Don't wait up. With that, he was gone. The sound of his sports car's engine revving aggressively as he tore down the driveway. I waited until the sound faded before reaching for my own phone. Not my regular iPhone, but the secure device I used for my investigation. He's on his way to the office, I told Naomi when she answered. Gathering the executive team for an ISR emergency meeting. We know, she replied. Thomas Chen just called. He's been summoned as part of the investor group. Maxwell is trying to secure emergency bridge financing to cover the Milan overruns. Will he succeed? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not a chance, Naomi said confidently. Our team has been quietly speaking with all potential sources. No one's willing to throw good money after bad, especially with the platinum. Vote happening today. I moved to my study, closing the door before continuing. What's our status? Documentation is ready, Naomi confirmed. Legal has prepared 3 scenarios based on how the board responds. The moment Platinum announces they're pulling out, we'll be ready to move. And me? What's the plan for managing the revelation of my involvement? PR has prepared statements for all major publications, she said. We're positioning it as a civic responsibility, rather than a direct response to Maxwell's dismissive treatment, more professional, less personal. I appreciated the approach. While part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing Maxwell forced to acknowledge his misjudgment, the justice system and the company's survival needed to be protected, from appearing as vehicles for marital drama. What about our people inside Franklin? I asked. They'll maintain their positions through the transition, Naomi assured me. Thomas will broker the initial conversation with the board once Platinum pulls out. Most of the directors already suspect trouble. They just don't know there's a solution waiting in the wings. I ended the call and spent the next hour reviewing financial projections and contingency scenarios. Unlike Maxwell's frantic scramble to salvage his overextended expansion, my preparation had been methodical, developed over years rather than hours. By the time I changed into a simple but elegant suit, appropriate for the meetings that would soon be necessary, I felt a strange calm. The storm was breaking, but I had built my shelter long ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth. Hamilton, board vote complete. Unanimous decision to terminate all financing. James making calls now. I checked the time. 1:42 p.m. Earlier than expected, the dominoes would begin falling immediately. As if on cue, my regular phone lit up with Maxwell's name. I let it ring, twice before answering, composing my expression even though he couldn't see me. Hello? Victoria. His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of panic. I need you to do something for me. Of course, I said, maintaining the supportive wife role one last time. What do you need? The Callaways, the wedding clients from last night? Call them and secure the contract today. We need the deposit. I frowned, genuinely confused. Maxwell, that's a single event contract. It's substantial, but nothing that would impact the company's overall position. Silence hung for a moment before he responded, his voice now edged with irritation. Just make the call, Victoria. We need every bit of cash flow right now. Don't worry about why. Is everything all right? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to maintain my pretense of ignorance. Everything's fine, he snapped. Just some temporary liquidity issues. Nothing for you to worry about. Should I call the bank? I suggested. I could transfer funds from our personal accounts to help with. No. The word exploded with such force I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Don't touch our personal accounts. Don't talk to the bank. Just call the Callaways and get that contract signed. After he hung up, I stood motionless for several moments, contemplating the desperation in his voice. The Franklin Automotive empire was crumbling faster than even I had anticipated. Maxwell was grasping at straws. A wedding contract worth a few $100,000 when his company needed tens of millions to stay afloat. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message. From Thomas Chen. Franklin Board emergency meeting called for 4 p.m. Platinum announcement expected at market open tomorrow. We're ready to move when you give the word. I sent a simple reply. Proceed as planned. Then I made another call. Not to the Callaways, but to Olivia. I need the car in 20 minutes, I told my assistant, and I'll need access to the SEC offices. It's time. For 3 years, I had maintained a careful separation between my identities. Victoria Franklin, the decorative wife who managed social calendars and charity events, never visited federal offices or financial crime investigators. The woman who had meticulously documented Maxwell's fraud, unnamed in official reports until now, never attended the social functions where Victoria Franklin shone. Today, those identities would merge. As my driver navigated through Sunday afternoon traffic toward downtown, I reviewed the series of events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. By tomorrow morning, Platinum would announce its withdrawal from all Franklin Automotive projects. By noon, Franklin's stock would be in free fall. By close of business, the board would be desperately seeking options to avoid complete collapse. And I would present them with both the problem and the solution, irrefutable evidence of Maxwell's crimes, along with a restructuring plan that could save the company itself. My phone buzzed continuously throughout the drive, Maxwell calling repeatedly, growing increasingly frantic as the reality of his situation became clearer. I let the calls go to voicemail, knowing there was nothing I could say that would matter now. The time for pretense had passed. The federal building looked particularly imposing on this quiet Sunday afternoon, its glass and steel facade reflecting the cloudy sky. I had arranged this meeting days ago, anticipating the acceleration of events once Platinum discovered the tough Dubai discrepancies. Agent Sarah Michaels met me in the lobby, her expression professionally neutral as she escorted me to a conference room where 2 other agents and a representative from the securities division waited. Mrs. Franklin, Agent Michaels began once we were seated, we appreciate you coming in person today. I understand you have additional documentation regarding Franklin Automotive Group's financial reporting? I removed a flash drive from my purse and placed it on the table. This contains everything my team and I have gathered over the past 3 years. Bank records, altered financial statements, email correspondence, wire transfer confirmations, comprehensive evidence of securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement totaling approximately $34 million. One of the agents raised an eyebrow. Your team? I hired private forensic accountants and legal experts to assist with the investigation, I explained. All former federal investigators with appropriate clearances and experience. Their credentials are included in the documentation. And your own involvement? The securities representative asked. What prompted this investigation? I'm a certified forensic accountant with a specialty in financial crimes, I said, handing over my credentials. Before my marriage, I worked with Hanover Financial Investigations. 3 years ago, I noticed discrepancies in Franklin Automotive's quarterly reports that suggested possible fraud. And you've been investigating your husband's company in secret since then? Agent Michaels asked, her tone carefully neutral. Yes. May I ask why you didn't come forward sooner? It was the question I had anticipated. Initially, I wasn't certain of the extent of the fraud or who was responsible. I needed comprehensive evidence before making accusations, particularly given my relationship to the CEO. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that a premature disclosure would likely result in destroyed evidence and financial collapse of a company that employs over 5,000 people. The agents exchanged glances. By building a complete case first, I continued, we can ensure that those responsible are held accountable while providing the board with a viable path forward for the company itself. And does your husband know about your investigation? The securities representative asked. No, I said simply. Maxwell has consistently underestimated my understanding of financial matters. It never occurred to him that I might be monitoring his business activities. That must have been challenging, Agent Michaels observed carefully. Being underestimated often is, I replied. But in this case, it provided the perfect cover for gathering evidence without alerting the subjects of the investigation. For the next 2 hours, I walked the team through the key components of our findings: the systematic transfer of funds through shell companies, the fraudulent reporting to investors, the manipulation of inventory figures to inflate valuation. The agents were thorough, professional, and increasingly impressed by the detail and organization of the evidence we had compiled. This is remarkably comprehensive, the securities representative said finally. One of the most complete cases I've seen presented by an outside investigator. Forensic accounting was my profession, I said simply. Just because I married a CEO doesn't mean I lost my skills or ethics. Agent Michaels nodded, understanding evident in her expression. We'll need you to come back tomorrow to formalize your statement. Based on what we've reviewed today, we'll be moving quickly. Do you have concerns about returning to your home given your husband's likely reaction once this becomes public? I appreciated her consideration. I've made arrangements for alternative accommodations if necessary. My primary concern is ensuring the evidence is properly handled and that Franklin Automotive can survive this with appropriate restructuring. And do you have someone you can trust on the board? One of the agents asked. Someone who will understand the severity of the situation when we contact them? Thomas Chen, I said without hesitation. He suspected problems for some time, but lacked the evidence to act. He'll work with you to manage the transition. As we concluded the meeting, Agent Michaels walked me to the elevator. It's not every day we see a case like this, she said quietly. Most financial fraud investigations drag on for years because those closest to the perpetrators either don't see the signs or choose to ignore them. Or benefit from them, I added. She nodded. Your position would have afforded you significant material advantages from your husband's scheme. Many would have looked the other way. Material advantages obtained through fraud aren't advantages at all, I said firmly. They're borrowed time, ticking bombs. I've seen too many lives destroyed when financial crimes finally come to light. Still, she said as the elevator arrived, it couldn't have been easy. Investigating your own husband, maintaining the facade while building this case. I stepped into the elevator, turning to face her as the doors began to close. Being dismissed as just a trophy wife provided the perfect cover, I said. Maxwell never suspected I could be anything more. That was his mistake. As I left the federal building, my phone buzzed with a text from Naomi. Franklin board meeting in progress. Maxwell trying to dismiss concerns, but Chen and Reynolds asking pointed questions about Dubai numbers. Status update? I replied. Simply, SEC engaged. Full disclosure to board tomorrow. Proceed with media standby. The next phase was in motion. By this time tomorrow, the carefully constructed image of Maxwell Franklin, visionary automotive CEO, would be shattered beyond repair. The question was no longer whether his crimes would be exposed, but how the company and its employees would survive the fallout. As my driver navigated back through the city streets, I allowed myself a moment to contemplate the future. For years, my identity had been defined in relation to Maxwell, his wife, his hostess, his decorative companion. Even my secret investigation had been shaped by his dismissal, his underestimation. Tomorrow would bring a new reality. Victoria Franklin would no longer be seen as just a trophy wife, but as a forensic accountant who had exposed significant financial crimes. The board would need to decide how to move forward, how to rebuild trust with investors, and preserve the company Maxwell had built and then betrayed. And I would need to define myself, not in opposition to Maxwell's dismissal, but according to my own values and abilities. The investigation had given me purpose and focus during years of being underestimated. What would I build in its place once that chapter closed? The question lingered as we pulled into the circular driveway of the mansion that had been my home for the past decade. A home that suddenly felt like a museum of false assumptions and carefully maintained appearances. Tomorrow would bring the truth into the open, shattering the illusion that had defined our marriage and Maxwell's career. In the calm before that storm, I prepared to play the supportive wife one final time. Maxwell's keycard still worked when he arrived home just after midnight, but that would change tomorrow. The house was dark except for a single light burning in my study. I found him there, slumped in one of the visitor chairs, an empty glass in one hand and a half-empty bottle of 30-year-old Macallan on the desk before him. The man who had left that morning, harried but still commanding, still certain of his ability to solve any crisis, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. His normally impeccable appearance had disintegrated, tie hanging loose around his neck, shirt wrinkled and partially unbuttoned, hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it. He didn't look up when I entered, though he must have heard me. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the bookshelf, a wedding gift from my parents. "Is it true?" he finally asked, voice hoarse. I set down my bag and moved to the chair behind my desk, straightening my skirt as I sat, a habitual gesture from countless interrogations of financial criminals during my previous career. "Yes," I said simply. He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot, but lucid. "How long?" "I've been investigating for 3 years. 3 years, he repeated, a bitter smile twisting his lips. 3 years of lying to my face. "I never lied," I corrected calmly. "You never asked. You never showed any interest in what I did with my time as long as I was available when you needed a hostess or a social secretary. Don't put this on me," he snapped, anger briefly overtaking his exhaustion. "You deliberately hid this. You worked with the feds behind my back." "Not initially," I said. "That came later, when the evidence became too significant to ignore." He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Evidence? Is that what you call it? You've been spying on me, gathering evidence to destroy me while sleeping in my bed, spending my money." "Your money?" I interrupted, my calm finally fracturing. "You mean the money you embezzled from your investors? The funds you diverted from company accounts? Let's be precise, Maxwell. The money was never truly yours." He stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. "Who are you?" he whispered. "The same person I've always been," I replied, regaining my composure. "The Cornell graduate who specialized in forensic accounting. The investigator who testified in 3 major financial crime cases. The woman who suggested the Milan expansion that you later used to launder money through inflated construction costs." I leaned forward, holding his gaze. "I'm the wife who listened when you mocked my financial acumen at dinner parties. The wife who watched you take credit for my ideas because you couldn't imagine they had originated with me. The wife who finally realized that no matter what I achieved, you would only ever see me as an extension of yourself, a decorative accessory rather than a partner." Something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the first glimmer of recognition. "So, this is revenge?" he said, his voice low. "You built a case against me because I didn't take your business opinions seriously?" "No, Maxwell," I said, with a sigh. "I built a case against you because you committed serious financial crimes. I kept it separate from our marriage because you made it abundantly clear you didn't want a wife with opinions that might challenge yours. And I'm turning over the evidence because it's the right thing to do. Nothing more, nothing less. He drained his glass and reached for the bottle, pouring another generous measure. You must have enjoyed it, he said, bitterness edging his words. Sitting there at all those dinners, listening to me talk about the business while you secretly investigated me, laughing at me behind my back. I never laughed at you, Maxwell, I said quietly. I admired your vision, your ambition. I still do, but I couldn't respect the way you achieved it, through fraud, through deception, through dismissing anyone who questioned your methods. He slammed the glass down, scotch sloshing over the rim. Then why not just leave? Why the elaborate investigation for 3 years? It was the question I had asked myself countless times, the answer evolving as both the evidence and our marriage had changed. At first it was uncertainty, I explained. I noticed the discrepancies but wasn't sure who was responsible or how extensive the problem was. Then, as I gathered more information, I recognized that premature disclosure would likely lead to destroyed evidence and possibly the collapse of the entire company. How considerate, he said sarcastically. Thousands of employees thank you for your restraint. Those employees are precisely why I approach this methodically, I countered. A proper investigation and orderly disclosure gives the company its best chance at surviving this. The board can restructure, implement proper controls, preserve most operations. The board, Maxwell spat the words. Chen and his allies have already suspended me pending a formal vote tomorrow. Temporary administrative leave, they called it, as if there's anything temporary about this situation. I had expected this development but hadn't anticipated hearing about it from Maxwell. Directly, the board was moving faster than even I had predicted. Thomas was always more perceptive than you gave him credit for, I observed. He suspected problems with the Dubai operation months ago. Thomas knew about your investigation. Maxwell asked, fresh betrayal coloring his tone. Not until recently, I said. But once Platinum decided to pull financing, he needed to understand the full picture to help preserve the company. Maxwell shook his head, unwilling or unable to accept this explanation. All those years, he muttered. All those investor meetings where I brought you along to charm the clients, and you were studying them, planning to turn them against me. No one turned against you, Maxwell, I said firmly. You did this to yourself. The fraudulent reports, the embezzlement, the wire transfers to offshore accounts. Those were your decisions. The consequences of those actions are your responsibility, not mine. My decisions, he corrected, voice hardening. Say it, Victoria. This is my failure. Not entirely, I acknowledged. Your finance team bears responsibility for implementing the schemes. Your board should have provided better oversight. Platinum should have conducted more thorough due diligence before backing the expansion. I paused, meeting his gaze directly. But yes, ultimately the culture that allowed this to happen comes from the top. From you. He flinched as if I'd struck him. For a moment I thought he might lash out, his knuckles whitening around the glass. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him as suddenly as it had flared. So, what happens now? He asked, voice hollow. Tomorrow morning, Platinum will announce they're terminating all financing for Franklin Automotive, I explained, shifting into the calm, professional tone I'd used in countless depositions. Your stock will be halted after dropping below critical thresholds. By midday, the board will receive formal notification from the SEC regarding the fraud investigation. By close of business, they'll be appointing interim leadership and considering a restructuring plan to prevent complete collapse. I reached into my bag and removed a slim folder, placing it on the desk between us. This contains the key points of that restructuring plan, a roadmap for preserving the company's core operations while addressing the fraudulent activities. It's what I'll be presenting to the board tomorrow. Maxwell made no move to touch the Folder. And me? What happens to me? I met his gaze steadily. The evidence is comprehensive, Maxwell. Securities fraud, wire fraud, embezzlement, multiple federal charges. Your legal team will explain the options, but given the scale and duration of the crimes, prison time is inevitable. He absorbed this with surprising calm, as if some part of him had always known this day would come. You'll testify against me, he said. Not a question. Yes, I confirmed. I'll provide a complete statement of my investigation and findings. He nodded slowly, then gestured to the folder. And after the dust settles, what happens to Franklin Automotive? With proper restructuring and transparent leadership, the company can survive, I said. The domestic dealerships remain profitable. Even some of the European expansion can be salvaged with honest accounting and appropriate scaling. Under new leadership, he added, someone the board and investors can trust to clean up my mess. I said nothing, letting the implication hang in the air between us. Maxwell studied me, some of his analytical capacity seeming to return despite the scotch. That's why you prepared the restructuring plan. You're positioning yourself to take over. The board will make its own decisions, I said carefully. I've simply provided them with options. Options that conveniently position you as the ideal candidate, he observed, a flicker of his former shrewdness emerging. The forensic accountant who uncovered the fraud, who can restore investor confidence and implement proper controls. The perfect redemption story after the disgraced husband. His assessment was accurate, though I hadn't expected him to see it so clearly through the haze of alcohol and shock. The company needs leadership untainted by the fraud, I said simply. Someone with both financial expertise and intimate knowledge of the operations. And what better candidate than the trophy wife nobody took seriously? Maxwell finished, a hint of dark humor in his voice. I have to admit, it's a compelling narrative. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with new awareness. You know what the strangest part is? You'd probably be excellent at it. All those board meetings where I treated your input as irrelevant, all those investor dinners where I showcased you like an acquisition rather than a partner. I missed what was right in front of me. This unexpected acknowledgement caught me off guard. I had prepared for anger, denial, accusations, not this moment of clarity. Why did you do it, Maxwell? I asked, the question that had haunted me for 3 years finally emerging. The company was successful, expanding legitimately. Why risk everything on fraud? He considered the question, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It started small, he said finally. A temporary solution to a cash flow problem during the economic downturn. Easy to justify when you tell yourself it's just until things improve. He shrugged. But once you cross that line, each subsequent step becomes easier to rationalize. The numbers needed to keep looking better. The expansion needed to move faster. The competition needed to be outpaced. And dismissing me? I pressed, unable to help myself. Treating my expertise as irrelevant? Was that also a strategy? Maxwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was different. At first, having you focus on the social aspects of our life together was convenient. Business and pleasure separated neatly. But over time, you began to believe your own narrative, I finished for him. That I was just decorative, incapable of understanding the complexities of your world. Yes, he admitted, quietly. It was easier than acknowledging I might be accountable to someone who could see through the facade, especially as the fraud expanded. The confession hung between us, the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive. You should go, I said finally. Pack what you need for the next few days. Your lawyer will contact you in the morning. About surrendering to federal authorities. And you? He asked, rising unsteadily from his chair. Will you be here when they come for me? I shook my head. I'll be meeting with the board. They've called an emergency session for 9 a.m. Maxwell nodded, seeming to understand that our paths were now diverging irrevocably. At the door, he paused, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between resignation and respect. "For what it's worth, Victoria, you would have been a remarkable partner if I'd had the sense to see it. Perhaps in another life, one where I wasn't so determined to be the only star in our constellation." With that oddly poetic observation, he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward what we both knew would be his final night in the home we had shared. I remained at my desk long after he'd gone, contemplating the swift, decisive end to a chapter of my life that had extended far longer than I had once imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning, not just for me but for the company Maxwell had built and then betrayed through his own hubris. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had lived in the shadow of Maxwell's dismissal, gathering evidence, while being underestimated. Now I would step into the light, not as an extension of his identity, but as the antithesis of everything he had come to represent: integrity over deception, substance over appearance, inclusive leadership over autocratic control. As I finally rose to prepare for the challenges of the coming day, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, no longer the carefully crafted image of a trophy wife, but the clear-eyed gaze of a woman who had found unexpected strength in being underestimated and was now ready to redefine herself on her own terms. Morning arrived with the clockwork precision of justice long deferred. I awoke before dawn, my night spent in the guest bedroom rather than the master suite that held too many echoes of a marriage built on false assumptions. Maxwell's car was gone from the driveway, his closet emptied of essentials when I checked, a small mercy that meant I wouldn't have to witness his arrest when federal agents arrived later that morning. I dressed with deliberate care, a charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation, my grandmother's pearl earrings that had been my graduation gift from Cornell, hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Today, Victoria Franklin would formally shed the trophy wife image that had served as both constraint and cover for so many years. As I reviewed my presentation for the board one final time, my phone lit up with a news alert. Platinum Investments terminates all financing for Franklin Automotive Group amid accounting concerns. The cascade had begun right on schedule. The second news alert followed minutes later. Franklin Automotive Group, FAG, trading halted after 42% pre-market drop. The financial markets were responding with predictable panic to the platinum announcement, even without the full details of the fraud that would emerge later today. My secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Michaels. Arrest warrant approved. Will be executed at 10:30 a.m. Board notification proceeding as discussed. Everything was unfolding according to the carefully orchestrated timeline we had developed. By the time I arrived at Franklin Automotive's headquarters, the lobby was buzzing with nervous energy. Employees clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, faces tense with uncertainty about what the platinum announcement meant for their jobs and futures. The executive floor, normally a hive of activity, was eerily quiet. Maxwell's corner office stood empty, the door open, his executive assistant's desk abandoned. The boardroom, however, was at capacity, all 12 directors present, along with the company's legal counsel, the CFO Gregory Vance, looking ashen, and representatives from Platinum Investments, including James Hamilton himself. Thomas Chen, the board chairman, rose as I entered. "Mrs. Franklin, thank you for joining us on such short notice." His formal tone was for the benefit of those board members who weren't yet aware of my role in the investigation. That would change within moments. "Of course," I replied, taking the empty seat that had been left at the table, notably not the visitor's chair where spouses were typically placed during rare appearances at board functions. "I understand the situation is urgent." "That would be an understatement," James Hamilton said grimly. "This morning, Platinum Investments formally terminated all financing agreements with Franklin Automotive Group due to serious concerns regarding financial reporting and potential fraud. Several board members who hadn't been briefed looked shocked, while others, including Thomas, remained stonily impassive, having been prepared for this announcement. "What exactly are you alleging?" demanded Robert Keller, one of Maxwell's oldest allies on the board. James glanced at Thomas, who nodded slightly before addressing the room. "This isn't merely an allegation. We have received notification from the Securities and Exchange Commission that Franklin Automotive Group is under federal investigation for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The room erupted in exclamations of shock and disbelief. Gregory Vance looked on the verge of collapse, while Maxwell's allies demanded explanations and proof. "The evidence is extensive and compelling," Thomas continued once the initial outcry had subsided. "The SEC has informed us that federal agents are in the process of arresting Maxwell Franklin this morning, based on documentation of systematic fraud dating back at least 5 years. All eyes turned to me, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why was the CEO's wife present for this devastating revelation? Thomas answered the unasked question. "Mrs. Franklin is here at my specific request, for reasons that will become clear momentarily." He nodded to me. "Victoria, would you please share with the board what you've shared with me and the federal authorities?" I opened my portfolio and met the gaze of each person around the table before speaking. "For the past 3 years, I have been conducting a forensic investigation into financial irregularities at Franklin Automotive Group, specifically focusing on the Dubai operations, the European expansion, and a pattern of suspicious wire transfers to offshore accounts." The shock in the room was palpable. Maxwell's remaining allies looked disbelieving, while others appeared confused or wary. "You've been investigating your husband's company?" Robert Keller asked incredulously. "Under what authority?" "Under the authority of my professional training and ethical obligation," I replied calmly. "I am a certified forensic accountant who specialized in financial crimes investigation before my marriage. When I detected clear signs of fraud within the company, I had a responsibility to document and report it." "And why are we just hearing about this now?" demanded another director. "Because a premature disclosure without comprehensive evidence would have likely resulted in document destruction and potential collapse of the company," I explained. "My goal was always to preserve Franklin Automotive while ensuring accountability for the specific individuals involved in the fraudulent activities." I distributed copies of the executive summary I had prepared, outlining the key findings of my investigation without overwhelming them with technical details. This overview documents the systematic fraud perpetrated primarily by Maxwell Franklin with the assistance of 3 members of the finance team. The complete evidence has been provided to the SEC and FBI. As the directors reviewed the document, expressions of disbelief turned to concern, then anger. The scope of the fraud, over $34 million embezzled through a complex scheme of falsified reports, inflated costs, and offshore transfers, was breathtaking even to those familiar with creative accounting. "My God," whispered one of the directors. "How did we miss this?" "The scheme was deliberately designed to exploit gaps in oversight," I explained, without the accusatory tone I might have been justified in using. "The audit committee was provided with carefully sanitized reports, while the full board relied on summary data that concealed the inconsistencies." James Hamilton cleared his throat. "Platinum's due diligence also failed to detect these issues until recently, something for which we bear responsibility. However, our immediate concern must be the company's survival." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "Which brings us to the second reason for Mrs. Franklin's presence today. Victoria, would you please present your stabilization proposal?" I opened my presentation, which was displayed on the boardroom screens. This restructuring plan provides a framework for addressing the immediate crisis while preserving the company's core operations and protecting as many jobs as possible. For the next 30 minutes, I walked the board through a comprehensive strategy for financial stabilization, leadership transition, and restoration of investor confidence. The plan was detailed yet adaptable, acknowledging the challenges ahead, while offering a viable path forward. Throughout the presentation, I maintained a professional, solution-oriented approach, focusing on the company's future rather than Maxwell's crimes. "This is remarkably thorough," observed Janet Rivera, head of the audit committee after I concluded. "You've anticipated virtually every challenge we're likely to face in the coming months." "I've had 3 years to consider the implications," I replied simply. The room fell silent as the directors processed everything they had learned: the fraud, my investigation, the proposed path forward. It was Thomas who finally addressed the elephant in the room. "The board must now make several critical decisions," he said. "First, we must formally suspend Maxwell Franklin as CEO, given the criminal charges and evidence presented. Second, we must appoint interim leadership to implement this stabilization plan immediately. And third, we must decide how to communicate these developments to employees, investors, and the public." Robert Keller, still struggling with the revelations, shook his head. Who could possibly step in as CEO at this point? No one understands the full extent of the problem, and any outsider would take months to get up to speed, time we clearly don't have. Thomas looked directly at me. "I believe we have a candidate uniquely qualified to lead Franklin Automotive through this crisis." All eyes turned to me once again, many widening with realization. "You can't be serious, Robert," protested. "Maxwell's wife? This is completely inappropriate, regardless of her financial background." "With respect, Robert," Thomas responded firmly, "Victoria Franklin is not merely Maxwell's wife. She is a forensic accounting expert who has demonstrated exceptional insight into our operations, identified the fraud that escaped all our notice, and developed the most viable recovery strategy we've seen. The fact that she was married to the former CEO is incidental to her qualifications." James Hamilton nodded in agreement. "Platinum would strongly support Mrs. Franklin's appointment as interim CEO. Her understanding of both the problems and potential solutions is unmatched, and her leadership would send a powerful message about the company's commitment to transparency and ethical operations moving forward." The discussion that followed was intense, with directors raising legitimate concerns about potential conflicts of interest, my relationship to Maxwell, and the unprecedented nature of such an appointment. I addressed each question directly, neither defensive nor insistent, allowing my expertise and preparation to speak for themselves. After nearly an hour of debate, Thomas called for a vote. "All those in favor of appointing Victoria Franklin as interim CEO and board chair of Franklin Automotive Group, effective immediately, please raise your hands." One by one, hands lifted around the table. Thomas first, then James Hamilton, followed by Janet Rivera and others, until only Robert Keller and one other director remained opposed. The motion had passed with an overwhelming majority. "Congratulations, Mrs. Franklin," Thomas said formally. "The board has placed its trust in your leadership during this critical period." As the meeting concluded and directors filed out of the boardroom, some offering congratulations, others still processing the extraordinary developments, Thomas and James remained behind. "That went better than I expected," James admitted once. "We were alone. Though the real challenges are just beginning." "The company will survive this," I said with quiet confidence. "The core business remains sound. With proper leadership and transparency, we can rebuild trust with investors, customers, and employees." "And Maxwell?" Thomas asked carefully. "The media will be relentless about your relationship. They'll frame this as everything from a calculated takeover to a sensational revenge story." I had anticipated this concern. "My focus will be entirely on the company's recovery, not on Maxwell or our marriage. I'll make it clear that this is about professional ethics and business leadership, not personal drama. James nodded approvingly. That's the right approach. And for what it's worth, Victoria, I think the board made the only sensible choice today. You may be the only person who can salvage what Maxwell nearly destroyed. As they left to prepare for the press conference scheduled for later that afternoon, I remained in the boardroom, absorbing the monumental shift that had occurred. In less than 24 hours, I had transformed from the underestimated trophy wife to the CEO and board chair of a major automotive group in crisis. My phone buzzed with a message from Agent Michaels. Arrest executed without incident. Subject in custody. Press conference at 2 p.m. The justice system was moving forward with its process, just as Franklin Automotive was beginning its recovery under new leadership. The parallel paths that had defined my life for 3 years were now converging into a single, clearly defined road ahead. The irony wasn't lost on me. Maxwell had spent years dismissing my capabilities, showcasing me as a decorative accessory, while making decisions that gradually undermined everything he had built. Now I would use those same underestimated capabilities to save what remained of his company, transforming it into something stronger and more ethical than he had ever envisioned. As I gathered my materials and prepared to address the executive team waiting anxiously for direction, I felt a profound sense of purpose replacing the quiet determination that had sustained me through years of investigation. Being underestimated had provided the perfect cover for documenting Maxwell's crimes. Now, finally being recognized for my true abilities would provide the foundation for rebuilding what his crimes had nearly destroyed. The trophy wife had become the savior CEO, not through revenge or calculation, but through persistence, expertise, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when no one expected it of her. 6 months after the emergency board meeting that transformed both Franklin Automotive Group and my professional identity, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office, my office, watching the late afternoon sunlight illuminate the city skyline. The view was different from the one I'd had in my ladies' study at the mansion, more expansive, more visible to the world outside. The visibility seemed a fitting metaphor for the transformation my life had undergone. My phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. Reuters interview confirmed for tomorrow at 11 now. They're focusing on the 6-month turnaround story. The business press had maintained steady interest in the Franklin scandal and resurrection, as they often termed it, though the angle had gradually shifted from the sensational personal drama to the remarkable business recovery. The company's restructuring had exceeded financial projections, with dealerships showing significant improvement in both sales figures and profit margins. Once transparent accounting and ethical leadership replaced the culture of deception Maxwell had fostered. Even more gratifying had been the industry recognition last month, when Automotive Business Review named me Executive of the Year, specifically citing the swift and decisive leadership that transformed a company in crisis into a model of corporate governance and recovery. The award ceremony had been particularly satisfying as several executives who had once smiled indulgently at my charming interest in automotive finance now approached me for insights into market trends. A knock at my office door interrupted my reflections. Naomi entered with her tablet in hand, her expression businesslike as always despite the late hour. The Berlin dealership final assessment is complete, she reported. The regulatory issues were even more extensive than initially documented, but the compliance team believes they can resolve all outstanding matters without significantly impacting operations. Updated timeline and budget are ready for your review. I nodded, unsurprised by the findings. The Berlin dealership had been the most problematic of Franklin's European expansion sites, with multiple layers of concealed compliance failures that had emerged during our comprehensive audit. And the Dubai operation? I asked, referring to the division whose fraudulent performance reports had precipitated Franklin Automotive's crisis. Stabilized, Naomi confirmed. 4 consecutive months of authentic growth since we implemented the revised business model. Still below the fabricated projections that were presented to investors, but significantly above regional averages for the market. Send the full reports to my secure server, I instructed. I'll review them tonight. As Naomi turned to leave, she paused. Also, Mr. Franklin's sentencing hearing has been scheduled for next week. His attorney has requested your presence. The formal reference to Maxwell as Mr. Franklin reflected the professional boundaries we had maintained throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. Despite my intimate knowledge of his crimes, I had carefully separated my testimony from any personal aspects of our marriage. Thank you, I said. Has the attorney indicated why they want me there? Character testimony, Naomi replied. They believe your statement regarding his cooperation after the arrest might influence the judge toward leniency. After Naomi departed, I considered this unexpected development. Maxwell had indeed cooperated with federal investigators after his initial arrest, providing detailed information about the fraud and accepting a plea agreement rather than dragging the company through a protracted trial. His actions had spared Franklin Automotive additional damage and allowed the restructuring to proceed more smoothly. But character testimony from the wife who had investigated and exposed his crimes? That seemed an unusual strategy, even for a desperate defense team facing substantial prison time for their client. My phone rang, pulling me from these thoughts. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize from the federal prison where Maxwell awaited sentencing. Victoria Franklin, I answered, my voice neutral. Victoria? Maxwell's voice sounded tired but clear. Thank you for taking my call. I understand your attorney wants me at the sentencing hearing, I said, bypassing pleasantries for the direct approach that had always characterized our most honest interactions. Yes, he confirmed, though I wanted to speak with you directly. First, to explain why. I moved from the window to my desk, sitting down and switching to speakerphone. I'm listening. I'm not asking for character testimony in the traditional sense, he said. I'm not expecting you to stand up and tell the judge what a wonderful husband I was, or that I deserve leniency because of some hidden virtues. That's fortunate, I replied, since we both know that wouldn't be truthful testimony. A soft chuckle came through the line, surprising me with its lack of bitterness. No, it wouldn't be. But there is something I believe would be truthful, something that might help the judge understand the full context, which is that Franklin Automotive Group is surviving, thriving even, under your leadership. That the restructuring plan you implemented has saved thousands of jobs. That my cooperation, limited as it was, contributed to that outcome. I considered his words carefully. You want me to testify that your crimes didn't ultimately destroy the company, so your sentence should reflect that limited damage? Put simply, yes, he admitted. The sentencing guidelines give the judge considerable discretion based on factors including actual financial harm to victims. Under your leadership, Franklin's investors, employees, and customers have largely been protected from the worst potential outcomes of my actions. His analysis was legally sound, I had to admit. The judge would indeed consider the final impact of the fraud when determining Maxwell's sentence. And Franklin Automotive Group's remarkable recovery would be a mitigating factor. A recovery that Maxwell's post-arrest cooperation had facilitated, however marginally. I'll need to consult with the company's counsel, I said finally. Any testimony I give must represent Franklin Automotive's interests, not yours personally. I understand, he replied. That's all I'm asking. For you to present the factual business outcome, nothing more. A moment of silence stretched between us before he spoke again, his tone shifting from the pragmatic legal discussion to something more reflective. Your 6-month earnings report was impressive, he said, the European restructuring especially. I wouldn't have thought those dealerships could be salvaged given the regulatory issues. Most of your advisors agreed with that assessment, I replied. But they were approaching the problem from the same perspective that created it, looking for shortcuts and workarounds rather than addressing the fundamental compliance issues directly. Your approach was better, he acknowledged simply. More sustainable. The kind of strategy I might have implemented myself, if I hadn't been so fixated on rapid expansion at any cost. This candid admission caught me by surprise. Throughout our marriage, Maxwell had rarely acknowledged anyone's business acumen as superior to his own, let alone mine. The board profile in Automotive Weekly was quite something, he continued. From crisis to transformation, how Victoria Franklin rebuilt more than a company, powerful narrative. I detected no sarcasm in his tone, only a thoughtful recognition of the public storyline that had emerged around Franklin Automotive's recovery. The press simplifies things, I said. They prefer clear heroes and villains, dramatic transformations. The reality is more complex. Maybe, he replied. Or maybe they got it essentially right this time. You did rebuild more than a company, Victoria. You rebuilt an entire corporate culture. Created something better than what existed before. Before I could respond to this unexpected assessment, Maxwell shifted topics again. I've had a lot of time to think in here, he said. About the company, about our marriage, about how thoroughly I underestimated you for all those years. Prison tends to provide that kind of reflective opportunity, I observed, keeping my tone neutral despite the personal turn in the conversation. Indeed it does, he agreed with a dry chuckle. And one thing I've realized is that my biggest mistake wasn't the fraud itself, though that was certainly significant. It was my failure to recognize what was right in front of me all along, a partner whose capabilities exceeded my own in many crucial areas. I remained silent, unsure how to respond to this belated recognition. If I had actually listened to you about the Milan regulatory concerns, if I had taken your financial analysis seriously instead of dismissing it, if I had treated you as a true partner rather than a decorative accessory, well, I might not be calling you from federal prison right now. That's probably true, I acknowledged. But those choices reflected who you were, Maxwell, who you chose to be as both a business leader and a husband. Yes, he said quietly, and I'm living with the consequences of those choices now. Another silence fell between us, more reflective than tense. The company is in good hands, he said finally. Better hands than mine ever were. Whatever happens at the sentencing, I wanted you to know that I recognize that now. After the call ended, I sat at my desk for several long moments, contemplating this unexpected evolution in Maxwell's perspective. Prison had apparently accomplished what years of marriage never could, forcing him to recognize not just his own failings, but the capabilities he had so consistently dismissed in me. It was a recognition that came far too late to save our marriage, or his career, but there was a certain symmetry to it nonetheless. The man who had built his identity around being the visionary leader of Franklin Automotive had finally seen the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along, that his trophy wife possessed the very qualities he had claimed as his exclusive domain. My phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Chen. Board dinner at 7 Hao to celebrate 6-month milestone. Car waiting downstairs whenever you're ready. The message pulled me back to the present and the responsibilities that now defined my professional life. The transformation of Franklin Automotive Group from a company in crisis to an industry model of recovery and ethical leadership had been demanding, all-consuming work. The celebration tonight would recognize not just my leadership, but the extraordinary efforts of the executive team and board who had embraced the challenging path forward. As I gathered my things to leave the office, the contrast between my current reality and the life I had lived just 6 months earlier seemed almost surreal. The woman who had once been showcased as Maxwell's beautiful, accomplished wife, relevant only in relation to him, had become a respected CEO in her own right, recognized for the very capabilities he had so consistently dismissed. My driver was waiting as promised, The sleek company car, a far cry from the passive role of passenger I had played for so many years in Maxwell's vehicles. As we navigated through evening traffic toward the restaurant, I reviewed the talking points for tomorrow's interview, including the most frequently asked question: how did it feel to transition from trophy wife to CEO? I had refined my answer over the months, focusing on the professional rather than personal aspects of the transformation. But Maxwell's unexpected call had stirred reflections I usually kept carefully compartmentalized. The truth was more nuanced than I typically shared with journalists. Being underestimated had indeed provided the perfect cover for my investigation, allowing me to gather evidence without raising Maxwell's suspicions. But that strategic advantage had come with a personal cost: years of having my intelligence dismissed, my insights ignored, my capabilities reduced to decorative status in my husband's narrative. The board dinner was being held at Azure, one of the city's premier restaurants with a private dining room that offered both elegance and discretion, essential qualities for a celebration that might attract unwanted media attention if held in a more public venue. Thomas greeted me as I arrived, his usually serious expression relaxed into a genuine smile. "Victoria, perfect timing. Everyone's just arriving." The boardroom table had been replaced by an elegantly set dining arrangement, with the 12 directors and key executives gathered in small conversational groups. These were the people who had taken a chance on an unconventional choice for CEO, who had supported the difficult decisions required for Franklin's recovery, who had helped transform a potential corporate collapse into one of the industry's most remarkable turnaround stories. James Hamilton approached with Elizabeth at his side, champagne flutes in hand. "Victoria, we were just discussing the Reuters interview tomorrow. A perfect opportunity to solidify the recovery narrative before the fourth quarter earnings announcement." I accepted the offered champagne with a smile, assuming those earnings match projections. "They'll exceed them," Elizabeth said confidently. "The preliminary figures from accounting are even stronger than forecast. The European restructuring is paying dividends faster than anyone anticipated." "Anyone except you," James added. "You projected this timeline from the beginning, as I recall." As dinner progressed, the conversation flowed easily between business achievements and forward-looking strategy. There was a palpable sense of accomplishment in the room, a shared pride in what we had built from the ashes of Maxwell's fraud. When Thomas rose to offer a toast, the room quieted immediately. 6 months ago, we faced what appeared to be an existential crisis," he began. "Our financing had evaporated, our stock had collapsed, our CEO was under federal indictment, and our very survival was in question." He gestured around the table. "Many advised liquidation. Some recommended bankruptcy protection. The conventional wisdom suggested our company could not possibly recover from such catastrophic damage." Thomas raised his glass toward me. But one person saw a different path, a difficult, demanding path that required unflinching honesty about our problems while maintaining absolute faith in our potential to overcome them. Victoria not only identified the cancer that was destroying our company from within, she provided the precise treatment plan to excise it and restore health to the organization. Murmurs of agreement circled the table as he continued. "The results speak for themselves. Stock price recovered to pre-crisis levels. European operations restructured and compliant. Investor confidence restored. A new corporate culture of transparency and integrity established at every level." "To Victoria Franklin," he concluded, "who taught us all that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person you need most." As glasses were raised around the table, I felt a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal vindication. The acknowledgement from this group, industry veterans who had witnessed my transformation from dismissed wife to respected leader, carried a significance beyond mere professional recognition. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began departing, Elizabeth Hamilton drew me aside. "I've been meaning to ask," she said quietly, Have you decided about Maxwell's sentencing hearing next week? I'll be there, I confirmed. Not to plead for leniency, but to provide factual testimony about the company's recovery and his cooperation after arrest. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. A professional gesture rather than a personal one. Exactly, I agreed. The company's interests require closure, not lingering drama about our marriage. And is there closure? She asked with the directness that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. For you personally, I mean. It was a question I rarely allowed myself to consider, focused as I had been on the all-consuming work of rebuilding Franklin Automotive. I think there will be, I said finally. After the sentencing, after the last of the legal proceedings, conclude. There will be space then to fully process everything that happened, not just the fraud and its aftermath, but the years of being dismissed, underestimated, relegated to a supporting role. And then what? Elizabeth pressed gently. When that chapter is truly closed? I glanced around the room at the board members and executives who now looked to me for leadership, at the company I had saved from Maxwell's crimes and reshaped, according to my own vision. Then I build something new, I said simply. Something that reflects my values and capabilities, without the shadow of having to prove myself in response to someone else's dismissal. Elizabeth smiled, understanding, evident in her expression. From reacting to creating, the ultimate transformation. Exactly, I agreed. Being underestimated provided motivation and strategic cover during a critical period. But leading from strength rather than strategic invisibility, that's the true opportunity ahead. As I left the restaurant that evening, I felt a sense of anticipation that went beyond the next day's interview or the upcoming earnings announcement. Maxwell's sentencing the following week would mark the end of a chapter that had dominated my life for nearly 4 years, from the first discovery of financial discrepancies through the methodical investigation and the dramatic revelations to the challenging work of reconstruction. What would follow was unwritten territory, leadership defined by vision rather than reaction, identity established through creation rather than revelation. The trophy wife had become the CEO through necessity and justice. What the CEO would become next was a question of choice and possibility. My driver was waiting at the curb, standing beside the car with professional deference. As I approached, I noticed a small package on the back seat, elegantly wrapped with a card bearing my name. "This was delivered for you during dinner, Ms. Franklin," he explained. Security checked it thoroughly before placing it in the vehicle. Inside the car, I opened the card first. "Victoria, I found this while sorting through personal effects before sentencing. It belongs with you now, not in a prison storage box. Consider it acknowledgement of a truth I was too blind to see for far too long. Maxwell." The package contained a velvet box, inside which lay a sapphire bracelet, the gift Maxwell had given me upon completing my certification in forensic accounting before our marriage, when he had still valued my professional identity. I had stopped wearing it years ago, around the same time he began introducing me only as his wife rather than as a financial expert in my own right. I held the bracelet in my palm, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. Unlike my investigation, documents, or the evidence that had led to Maxwell's conviction, this was a personal relic, a tangible reminder of a time when my capabilities had been recognized rather than dismissed by the man who would later define me solely in relation to himself. As the car pulled away from the curb, I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, not out of sentimentality for a failed marriage, but as a symbol of reclamation, of the professional identity I had temporarily submerged, of the capabilities that had always been mine, regardless of Maxwell's ability to recognize them. Tomorrow's Reuters interview would focus on Franklin Automotive's remarkable recovery under my leadership. The sentencing hearing would address Maxwell's crimes and their consequences. Both were important milestones in the public narrative of transformation from crisis to renewal. But the true story, the one I was still writing, went beyond corporate turnarounds or legal proceedings. It was about the journey from being defined by someone else's limitations to defining oneself through possibility, from using underestimation as strategic cover to leading openly with full recognition of one's capabilities. The city lights blurred past the car windows as we headed toward my downtown apartment, not the mansion that had been the stage for Maxwell's dismissal and my hidden investigation, but a space I had chosen for myself, designed according to my preferences rather than for impression management. In that moment of transition between the celebration of what had been accomplished and the anticipation of what lay ahead, I felt a profound sense of alignment between who I had always been and who I was now publicly recognized to be, between the capabilities Maxwell had dismissed and the leadership others now valued. Being underestimated had provided the perfect cover for building a case that ultimately saved a company from collapse. But being fully seen, acknowledged, and respected would provide the foundation for building something even more significant, a future defined not by reaction to dismissal, but by the full expression of potential long held in reserve. The trophy wife had become the CEO, and the CEO was now becoming herself, undefined by others' expectations, unlimited by others' perceptions, ready to lead not from the shadows of strategic invisibility, but from the clarity of recognized strength. When my story first became public, the trophy wife, who exposed her husband's financial crimes and was elected board chair of the company he nearly destroyed, I received thousands of messages from women who saw their own experiences reflected in mine. Not the specific circumstances, of course. Few women secretly investigate their husband's fraudulent business practices for 3 years before presenting the evidence to federal authorities. But the fundamental experience of being underestimated, dismissed, or defined by their relationship to someone else rather than by their own capabilities that resonated with countless women across industries and circumstances. So today, I want to speak directly to those of you who have felt that particular sting of dismissal, who have watched your ideas be ignored only to be celebrated when repeated by someone else, who have been introduced as someone's wife, rather than as a professional in your own right. First, let me acknowledge the reality. Being underestimated hurts. When Maxwell would laugh off my financial insights at dinner parties, or explain to others what I couldn't possibly understand, each dismissal cut deeply. There's a special kind of pain in having your capabilities denied by someone who is supposed to see and value you fully. I want you to know that your feelings of frustration, anger, or hurt in similar situations are entirely valid. But I also want to share what became the most unexpected lesson of my journey. Sometimes being underestimated can become your greatest strategic advantage. When people don't see your full capabilities, they also don't create obstacles to prevent your success. They don't view you as competition. They don't scrutinize your actions with suspicion or resistance. They simply don't pay attention, and that inattention can create space for you to build something extraordinary. In my case, Maxwell's absolute conviction that I couldn't understand complex financial matters gave me the perfect cover to investigate. His fraudulent practices while he remained completely unaware. His dismissal became my opportunity. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to operate in secrecy for years as I did. My approach was specific to my circumstances. But I am encouraging you to consider how the very underestimation that frustrates you might also offer unexpected freedom or opportunity. Another crucial lesson from my experience is the importance of separating your identity from others' perceptions. Throughout those years of dismissal, I never internalized Maxwell's limited view of me. I recognized it as his failure of perception, not my limitation of ability. This separation is essential. When someone dismisses your ideas or contributions, their assessment reflects their biases and limitations, not your worth or potential. Guard your self-knowledge fiercely against others' diminished perceptions of you. I maintained this separation partly through the support of people who did see me clearly, Elizabeth Hamilton, who recognized my financial acumen, Naomi Parker, who respected my investigative skills, even my grandmother, whose gift of a sapphire bracelet reminded me of who I truly was beneath the trophy wife facade. These support networks are vital when navigating environments where your value isn't recognized. Find people who see your capabilities clearly, who validate your perspective, who remind you of your worth when others try to diminish you. And when possible, be that person for other women facing similar dismissal. Since becoming CEO, I've made it a priority to implement recognition systems that identify and value contributions regardless of title or position. The junior financial analyst whose observations prove critical receives the same acknowledgement as the senior executive who implements the solution. This approach isn't just about fairness, it's about creating a culture where capability is recognized rather than overlooked based on preconceptions. One strategy that served me particularly well was using spaces coded as feminine, and therefore unimportant, to house my most significant work. My ladies' study, dismissed by Maxwell as merely the place where I managed household accounts, became the command center for my investigation, precisely because he undervalued anything associated with traditional femininity. Look for similar opportunities in your own context, areas that are overlooked or undervalued because of their association with femininity, which might provide unexpected freedom for meaningful work precisely because they're not taken seriously. Throughout my journey, I learned the importance of maintaining professional focus amid personal dynamics. When the evidence of Maxwell's fraud became clear, I made decisions based on what would benefit the company and justice system, not what would most effectively humiliate or punish him for years of dismissal. This professional focus amid complex personal feelings demonstrates leadership maturity and ultimately commands more respect than decisions driven by emotional reaction. It's particularly crucial for women, whose emotional responses are often scrutinized more harshly than men's. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to value recognition over revenge. Although the media initially framed my actions as revenge for years of dismissal, my true motivation was more nuanced. I wasn't primarily seeking to punish Maxwell, but to expose financial crimes and ultimately save a company worth saving. This distinction matters. Focusing on revenge keeps you oriented around the person who harmed you, while focusing on achievement and rightful recognition centers your own goals and growth. The satisfaction I felt came not from seeing Maxwell face consequences, but from finally being acknowledged for the financial expert I had always been. I also discovered the power of strategic visibility, choosing when and how to be seen. For years, I operated in deliberate obscurity, recognizing that invisibility provided advantages during my investigation. When circumstances required me to step into public view, I did so on my own terms, controlling the narrative and emphasizing professional ethics rather than personal drama. This approach can be powerful in environments that subject women to heightened scrutiny or double standards. Sometimes maintaining a low profile allows your work to speak for itself without the distortion of gender expectations. Other times, claiming public recognition becomes necessary to advance your goals. Finally, I want to acknowledge something that surprised me. Relationships can sometimes transform through recognition. Maxwell eventually evolved from dismissing me as just a trophy wife to acknowledging my superior financial acumen and leadership abilities. This transformation wasn't immediate or easy, happening only after his arrest and the collapse of his carefully constructed facade. Not all dismissive relationships can or should be salvaged. That's a deeply personal decision only you can make, for your specific circumstances. But my journey showed me that genuine recognition, seeing someone clearly for who they truly are, can sometimes create the foundation for a new kind of respect, even if the relationship itself doesn't continue. In its original form, your own path will be different from mine. Most of you won't be secretly building cases against fraudulent spouses while being dismissed as trophy wives. But the fundamental principles apply across contexts. Maintain your self-knowledge despite others' diminished perceptions. Find strategic advantages in being underestimated. Build networks of people who see your true capabilities. Focus on achievement and recognition rather than revenge, and choose visibility strategically. Most importantly, remember that your capabilities exist regardless of others' ability to recognize them. The people who dismiss you reveal their own limitations, not yours. I'd love to hear your own experiences. How have you responded to being underestimated? What strategies have worked for you? What challenges are you still navigating? Share your insights in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what another woman in our community needs to hear today. Remember, sometimes being underestimated is the perfect cover for building something extraordinary. Just as I was always more than just a trophy wife, you are more than how others choose to see you. Claim that truth and build from there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.